Hi there, Vibe Gardeners. Welcome to another episode of Vibe Gardening Inform Edition, where after some thinking, I feel like we need to do a deep dive into my garlic in container experiments. Now, with that said, let's go. Alright, guys, so last episode we concluded the 7-month experiment, garlic in containers experiment, but I really feel like we need to go in deep and talk about what actually happened because it was 7 months of experiments and it was a lot to cover, and I really don't think I give it the proper treatment that it needs. So I'm going to go into a little bit more of what I think about it, because the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking maybe vigor and how early the leaves emerge isn't exactly the full story. As a matter of fact, I think in the end, I really think that it was really just me confusing the heck out of Scarlix of where they are, what time of the year it is, and who they may even be are. But I think there's a lot of, and the other thing we gotta remember too is that this is also an experiment in my basement. I don't have full isolation like a lab experiment, so there's not as much scientific rigor. So this is an amateur in my basement experiment, so keep that in mind. And with that said, here we go. All right, so I actually went in there and I kind of went through all 7 episodes I had and kind of did a little summary in my head what's going on, took some notes, and jotted down 4 observations. So I'm going to start with my first observation, kind of like a clue as to what happened. So one of the things was we noticed this big pot here, the final survivor is in. It itself even had a split on germination between the 4 garlic, and the reality here is that it's besides that, there was also a pretty big stress on wet roots. If you guys remember, it was actually quite wet in the beginning and had to actually drill extra holes in the bottom, which actually you can see here. Had to drill extra hole at the bottom and on the side of the bottom to give it aeration because it just was not drying out fast enough. Which is interesting because in the beginning, that means it wasn't getting the nutrition like the 2 smaller pots. And really, I think that from there on, the variables kind of piled on. We really didn't quite know what really the influencing of these results were. So right there, we got stress of water on this pot with no stress on the 1 and 2 gallon. So there is a big split. So the second observation I kind of had that was kind of interesting was that that first clove that was harvested was from this big pot here. And what we saw was this big pot had all kind of interesting things happen because in the very beginning, the 2 small pots had really no stress. The water drying and watering cycle was pretty efficient. It was a week or less, which means those 2 were getting their nutrition as they needed. So what we already saw with the second observation is that for sure vigor was a big deal, because in this pot, the first one that emerged was also the first that had to basically recover from early stress and recover from not having additional nutrition to push it. So basically that strong recovery and rapid maturity really shows the genetic strength of this thing. So I think the second observation really, in a sense, supports that conclusion I had last time, in that genetics is a big play here. Another thing that really we wanted to address here is that, remember in the beginning when we talked about garlic, we talked about how each leaf on the garlic may indicate more cloves coming up, which means it's going to be a bigger bulb. But the reality is we saw in the very beginning that the 1 gallon pot, due to the less stress it got and the adequate nutrition, it was developing a lot of leaves. And clearly with this experiment, we saw that the 1 and 2 gallon got better feeding, better leaves. It didn't actually convert at all at the very end. In the end, what really converted was the ability to be able to recover quickly with the biology here. All right, so the fourth and final observation I had, which I think is the final judge on my new conclusion, is that obviously on month 5, we harvested the big one, right? But then starting month 6, even month 5 was kind of interesting in that the scape development was sort of normal, but then at month 6, when we looked at the 3 that ended up harvesting, remember how I said, oh yeah, the scapes were coming along, right? But a whole month passed, and the scape barely got longer. That to me is kind of like a real telltale sign that these plants got completely biologically confused about timing, season, heck, maybe even who they are, because there was no temperature change. Lighting was consistent. I mean, if I really paid attention, I probably would have changed the daylight length and started lower on daylight and increased as the plants matured. I never did that. So the plants literally had zero clue of what season they were, where they were going, or who they are. And that escape development, to, in my opinion, was the final nail in the coffin of what actually happened here with my final verdict in that, yes, this all has to do with the biological confusion of not knowing anything about natural clues because it wasn't natural, it was in my basement. Consistent temperature the whole entire time, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, almost same humidity, about near 50%, and the lighting was always 14 hours daylight. It had no clue what was going on, and that scrambled up made anything but the strongest genetics come through and deliver big. All right, so to sum it up in my conclusion here is that we see that this whole entire setup is not clean. It's my basement, it's amateur. There was a lot of variables I couldn't control and isolate because I don't have a lab environment here, right? But with that, one thing was true was the things I did control, I didn't make it reflect the season that the garlic was expecting. I gave it consistent everything the whole entire time. And the garlic had no biological clue or a natural clue of where to go with its developmental path. And what ended up happening was the strongest and vigorous garlic, which probably the top 5% of genetics or better, was just strong enough to be like, you know what, I can break through all this confusion and still make good garlic. And everyone else was just like, who am I again? And really crumbled. So in this experiment, I think we really proved one thing, and that is nothing beats natural. If you take that away, the plants will get confused and everything's off. So I hope that taught you a little bit about garlic and what I learned from the 7 month and my renewed conclusion here. So with that said, guys, keep gardening, keep vibing. Let's go.